Sydney thought she'd met someone she really liked. The first date went so well, she agreed to another one. But after that second date, she never came home. Viewer discretion is advised. The story involves murder, and if you've ever used a dating app, you know how completely normal this situation is. You match with somebody, you talk for a while, eventually you decide to meet, and hopefully you have a great time and a great connection. That's exactly how this story started for 24-year-old Sydney Loofe, and there was absolutely no reason for her to believe the woman that she had just met was leading her into something terrifying. So this happened in Nebraska in November of 2017. Sydney was 24 years old. She had a job, people who loved her, and like millions of other people her age, she occasionally used dating apps. One day, she matched on Tinder with a woman named Bailey Boswell. They started messaging, seemed to hit it off, and eventually decided to meet in person. The date apparently went really well because afterwards, Sydney told a friend that Bailey was funny and attractive, and she was excited about seeing her again. At this point, nothing about the situation seemed alarming. If anything, Sydney probably thought she'd gotten lucky and actually met somebody she connected with. A few days later, Bailey asked Sydney out again, and Sydney agreed. Before leaving, Sydney even posted a picture on Snapchat and mentioned that she was going on another date. Then she left to meet Bailey, expecting to come home afterward just like she had the first time. But when the night passed and nobody heard from Sydney, people started getting worried. She wasn't answering calls or texts, and when she didn't show up for work the following day, her family immediately knew that something simply wasn't right. I mean, Sydney would never not call into work, just something she wouldn't do. Police started retracing Sydney's movements, and pretty quickly they discovered that Bailey wasn't exactly who Sydney thought she was. Bailey lived with her boyfriend, Aubrey Trail, who was nearly 30 years older than her and already had a long history of criminal behavior. Investigators also learned that Sydney's last known movements connected her directly to Bailey. So naturally, police wanted to speak with both Bailey and Aubrey. Here's where things started getting really strange, because instead of sticking around and helping investigators figure out where Sydney was, the two of them disappeared. Then Bailey and Aubrey did something that honestly only makes the situation look even worse. They posted videos online talking about Sydney's disappearance and insisting they had absolutely nothing to do with it. They claimed Sydney had been fine when they last saw her, but investigators weren't convinced, and neither was Sydney's family. The videos didn't calm anyone down. If anything, they created even more questions about why these two people were suddenly defending themselves while Sydney was still missing. As investigators continued searching, the hope that Sydney would be found alive started to dissipate. Investigators started searching back roads, alleys, mysterious locations that were hard to find, but they couldn't find Sydney. Eventually, several weeks after Sydney disappeared, investigators found what everyone had been desperately hoping they wouldn't find. Her remains had been placed into garbage bags and scattered along rural roads. Once police began putting all the evidence together, the story became even more disturbing. Prosecutors said Bailey had used Tinder to lure Sydney into meeting her, and that Aubrey was involved in what happened afterward. What Sydney believed was a second date with a woman she liked had actually put her in the path of two people prosecutors said that had been discussing violent fantasies and looking for someone that they could manipulate. And if you think the story couldn't possibly get any stranger at this point, wait until you hear what happened during Aubrey's trial. He's sitting in the courtroom while witnesses are testifying, and suddenly he stands up and slashes his own throat with a concealed blade right there in front of the judge and jury. The courtroom erupts into chaos. Deputies rush toward him, and somehow Aubrey survives. Prosecutors later argued that the dramatic act was yet another attempt to manipulate everyone around him and shift attention away from the evidence being presented against him. Eventually, both Aubrey Trail and Bailey Boswell were convicted for their roles in Sydney's murder. Aubrey received a death sentence, while Bailey was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The convictions answered the questions of who was responsible, but they couldn't undo what happened to Sydney or give her family back the young woman that they loved. I think what makes Sydney's story especially frightening is how ordinary the beginning was. There wasn't some creepy stranger following her down a dark alley, and she wasn't doing something reckless or unusual. She met somebody through a dating app, went on a date that apparently went well, and agreed to see that person again. I mean, that's something people do every single day, which is exactly why this case stays with you. Sydney's family has always wanted people to remember who she was, rather than allowing the horrific way she died to become her entire story. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a young woman who should have had decades of life ahead of her. So while this case is certainly a warning about being careful when meeting somebody new, I think it's also important to remember that Sydney wasn't responsible for what happened to her. She trusted someone who deliberately deceived her, and the responsibility for that belongs entirely to the people who chose to hurt her. Until next time, remember that every ordinary person has an extraordinary story. I'm Amber Joy, and I'll see you in the next story.